During Jesus' ministry in the Galilee, he was doing a lot of things that displayed he was bringing heaven and earth back together. But it wasn't just in his actions and the miracles, it was also in his teaching that he displayed what it would look like as heaven and earth come back together. Now, a large portion of his teaching came in what were known as parables. Parables are these most often short stories in the Gospels that typically, sometimes we can find them very easy to understand, rather difficult, but they do form almost a genre of their own. And so in this session, we're going to focus in on the parables that Jesus taught through, and as well looking at how do we study them and apply them to our lives today. Now, parables, they're not allegories, and they're not these allegorical mysteries. Typically, they were clearly understood by the people that Jesus told them to. And that's the safest way, is to think of how did they understand them, and not how maybe we could understand them today and what all of these different elements could mean. Now, there's three types of parables. There's a true parable. A true parable is like a story. It has a plot, it has characters. Examples of these are like famous ones: the Good Samaritan, the Great Banquet, the Prodigal Son. These are typical parables. Then there's similitudes or illustrations. These are more short phrases or short sentences. The parable about the yeast or the mustard seed, just kind of quick phrases. And then beyond that, you have a metaphor. The salt, you are the salt of the earth. That's a parable, but it's also just in a metaphor form. So these are the three formats you can get. In most of these examples we'll go through these true parables. So how do you study them? Well, first, it's something that you need to exegete them. You need to interpret them. And parables, they were told almost like jokes, where the audience is listening to them, anticipating what comes next in the story. And at the moment where maybe Jesus would ask them and they would just continue the story with what seems to be the right answer, Jesus gives a totally opposite answer, and they're kind of caught in the story and realize this kind of meaning that Jesus intended as he catches them. And so if we're reading through them and we're not caught or think like, wow, that's rather strange that that's how the story played out, then it kind of shows we haven't understood the parable. So we need to read it in a way that we can also be caught in the narrative. And so the way we do this is by looking for what's known as the point of reference. And the point of references are the different characters in the parable, and determining which point of reference catches the hearer of the story. So, for example, in Luke chapter 7, Jesus tells a famous parable of a moneylender who had two debtors. This is Luke 7, verse 41. One owed a massive amount, and one owed a significantly little amount. And it's rather sordid, and he asks, who would love him more, the one that was forgiven a little or the one that's forgiven a lot? Now, this is not like an allegory in the sense that there's some meaning hidden to it that the original audience would not have heard. How would they have interpreted this? And the point of references are indicated by the response. The woman in the story refers to the sinful woman that is in the audience at the time of Jesus telling this parable. She's the one who's forgiven a great deal. And the one who's forgiven a little is the Pharisee who's invited Jesus into his house. And so we understand the points of reference by reading it in context. And so we see that this is a parable about the Pharisee who doesn't love Jesus so much because he doesn't think he needs to be forgiven of much, in comparison to the woman who comes into the meal where Jesus is eating, and really displays her love and affection because she realizes how much she has been forgiven. Again, this is a classic contrast in the book of Luke. You would think the religious ones are the ones who understand who Jesus is, and the ones who don't would be the sinners, the woman out in the street. And so as we go through this is what you need to do. To exegete a parable, you need to kind of read it repeatedly and identify all of the points of reference. This is a blend of observation and interpretation. Once you have observed each point of reference, then you need to look for where the subject gets caught. And so sometimes you have the context, who he's telling the parable to. Like we saw in Luke 7, the context just before he launches into the parable is, as I've said, he's eating in a Pharisee's house and a sinful woman comes in, and the Pharisee kind of judges that woman for her response to Jesus. But sometimes there's no context. We don't know, he's just telling it to a crowd, or we don't know who is the story being told to, and so it's a little harder to identify the audience. But as you go through the points of reference, it becomes more clear probably who is going to be caught in the story. Is this going to be a religious person that's caught, or is this going to be a Gentile person that's caught, and so on. So we can take another example. Luke chapter 5 is the first parable in the book of Luke, and it comes right after Jesus calls Levi, a tax collector, to join his team. And then it says in verse 29, Levi made a great feast in his house, and there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining with him at the table. In verse 30, and the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, "Why do they eat and drink with tax collectors?" So this is the scene that then sets up the parable. So you have to read them in context to figure out who Jesus is speaking with. And so in verse 33, it's a different question. They're asking about fasting, but Jesus is still in the context of just eating with just eating with tax collectors and sinners and what they're grumbling about. And so he tells this parable about not being able to sew an unshrunk cloth to a shrunken cloth. And he shares it in verse 36. He told them this parable: "No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear away the new piece, and the piece from the new will not match the old." Then he continues and says the same thing in verse 37. "And no one who puts new wine into old wineskin. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed." And he continues, "But the new wine will be put into fresh wineskins." And so what Jesus is saying is you can't take kind of bits of Jesus' teaching that you like and put them into John's teaching or even the Pharisees' teaching, because in the question they're asking about John's disciples fasting, but the wider context is they're challenging Jesus on who he's hanging out with, the tax collectors and the sinners. And it's the same with the wine. You can't put Jesus' teaching into the same thought or form or paradigm as John's or as the Pharisees. It just isn't going to fit. And so they need to change their mindset. And that's what he means by you need to have new wineskins to hold this new teaching that I am bringing. And so he's answering their question by saying, look, you don't understand me because you're just trying to add it into what you already have, which is what they were doing. And he says, you need to totally get rid of what you have, and then you'll understand what I'm doing here. Again, this is the upside down kingdom that Luke is proclaiming through the gospel. Luke is the only one in this parable that adds this final phrase, "And no one after drinking the old wine desires new, for he says, the old is good." Now, this parable is told in Matthew and Mark, but they don't have that last line, and it's obvious why Luke includes it, because so many people in Luke that reject Jesus' message is because they think what they have is good enough. The Pharisees think they've solved the problem. The Sadducees think that they're on the way to establish the kingdom. But it's the blind and the beggars and the Gentiles and the women who know they have nothing. And so anything that Jesus has, they respond to. And so he uses it as a very good critique to the Pharisees who think they don't need Jesus. And he says, the reason you don't need me is because you're fine with what you already have. And so this is how he catches them in the story. And so as you're interpreting them, you need to think, how do the original hearers identify with the story? How are they kind of in the fault of the story? Now, how do we go about applying this? Let's take another example from a famous story, and this is this parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. Well, you begin the same process. You reread the parable multiple times, identify the points of reference, and then update those points of reference to fit your context in your current day, and then the story kind of applies to you. So, if we're looking at Luke 10, this is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay? And the context is a lawyer. Now, a lawyer is someone who knows the law, not like a lawyer in court, but someone who studied the law, and most likely a Pharisee. And so the Pharisee gets up and asks Jesus a question. What shall I do to inherit eternal life? Now, this is a unique parable only to Luke. It's a famous one, but only Luke tells the story because it fits so perfectly into the message that he's drafting. Okay? And so he gets up and he asks Jesus, and Jesus tells him all of the things he's meant to do. Jesus responds back to the Pharisee and say, well, what does the law say? And he answers correctly what the law says, and then Jesus says, okay, like go and do this. But then he's wanting to further justify himself and says, well, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus tells this incredible story to kind of catch the Pharisee. Okay? And so, as we know how the story goes, there's a man going on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he's jumped by robbers. Then a priest on the way to leaving Jerusalem, on the way to Jericho, avoids the man, assuming he's dead and he doesn't want to defile himself. Okay, so he passes on by. Then a Levite, a little lower than a priest, walks by, and he does the same thing, not wanting to defile himself. Now, if we're hearing this story from the perspective of the lawyer, in his mind, if he's a Pharisee indeed, they were known for their giving and their charity. So he's probably anticipating Jesus to say, a Pharisee is now walking down the road and helps him, and you should do the same as a good Pharisee. But he doesn't, right? The next person coming down the road is a Samaritan. And this is where the Pharisee is caught in the story. And you notice at the end, in verse 36, it says, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor? And the lawyer can't even say the Samaritan. He just says, the one who showed him mercy. Because the Samaritans they're almost enemies to the Pharisees. They're seen as unclean, not part of the people of God, not righteous. They would be the last person at all. So if you want to apply this parable to your life, you observe each of these points of reference, figure out where the person is caught in the story, and then you have to catch yourself in the story. And so you would retell it and update the points of reference. So I'm a missionary. I work in missions, so I could retell the story and say, okay, a pastor's coming down the road, and he goes to the other side, and then a bishop is coming down, and he goes to the other side, and then I'd be expecting then the missionary comes down the road, and he saves the poor. But in the context, it would not be a missionary, it would be an atheist, or it would be a Muslim. They come down and they save the Samaritan person. And then it applies then into my life, because it calls for me not to view myself so highly, but to be caught in the parable and understand what true mercy looks like. It's people that don't always have it all together, not fitting in my religious category, but still serving the poor and needy. And so as we apply these to our lives, the parables, the best is to identify with, almost in a sense, the bad guy of the parable and then be caught in the story. So let's conclude our brief look at the parables with a classic parable that's in all of the Synoptic Gospels. It's the parable of the sower. Now Luke it's not the first parable, but it's the one by which he uses to explain the purpose of the parables. The purpose of the parables are meant, as it says in verse 8-10, to show the secrets of the kingdom of God. Kingdom parables specifically are meant to show the now aspect of the kingdom, what Jesus is presently doing, and they call for an urgent response for people to join in his kingdom movement. And so in the context of the parable of the sower, it begins 8 verse 1, soon afterwards he went through the cities and villages proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom to the villages kind of around Galilee. And people are responding, people are rejecting. And then there's a great crowd that gathers together from all the towns that he's just spoken at, 8 verse 4. And then he tells the parable. And so the audience is the people who have just heard everything that Jesus has been teaching. Okay, they're the crowds that are following him. Then Jesus tells the parable of a sower that goes out and sows his seed. Now this is Jesus, because that's just what he was doing. In the wider context of Scripture, God says after the exile, I will sow my people, right? As a sower sows his seed. And so in a sense, Jesus is saying, I've gone about sowing the people of God. I've gone about sharing about the end of exile, the coming of God's kingdom in and through the mission that I'm launching. And then he offers 3 options, okay? Now these are the 3 points of reference that each person in the crowd would then identify with. There's the path, and that's the devil comes and takes away the word from their hearts. There's the rocks. These are ones that have no roots and fall away in times of testing. There's the thorns that are choked by the cares and riches and pleasures of the life. And then lastly, the good soil. They're the ones who hear, hold fast, and bear fruit. And Jesus is indicating these are the various responses of my message, okay? And the catch is, if you're not responding correctly, then you're missing out on the exile. And so the first one, then you go about interpreting, the first one, the devil has convinced them of another path, right? This can be the villagers in the city of Nazareth that couldn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, or the Pharisees that they're kind of rejecting the word that Jesus is putting out. They don't believe in it. There's the others that when Jesus asks them to follow him, it costs too much. This is the rocks. There's too much of a test. It's too risky to join this revolution that you're proposing. The thorns. These are the people that are choked by the cares of the world, that when Jesus invites them into this new way, it kind of shakes up their status quo, shakes up what they expect to happen, and so they can't join in. And so Jesus talks about this is the generation that actually rejects Jesus and John because it doesn't fit with their agenda. This is Luke 7:21-34. So then the application of this is, well, which soil are we? Okay, but if we're meant to identify with more of the negative part, it's asking, okay, well, which of these reasons make it more difficult for me to follow Jesus? Okay, which path kind of seems the one that is most prevalent in my life that makes it difficult, and how do I replace that to become the good soil? Now, as we go through the book of Luke, he'll show that the good soil are really the poor and the marginalized. They're the ones that recognize their need. So we need to see, in conclusion, we need to see the parables as much as a display of Jesus' mission as his actual miracles and displays of the kingdom. And what's unique about the parables is they kind of create a little pocket in Jesus' teaching that we're able to very easily insert our own life and hear the stories afresh for ourselves. And so as you go through Luke, take a moment to look at the parables, read through them a few times, observe and the points of references, think through interpretation. How would they have understood this? How would they have been caught in that parable? And then kind of update the points of reference to put yourself in the story so that you can also apply its meaning to your life today.